Hi, Brian. It's Laura. Um, Long time no see. I was going to have her turn on grief support group and turn on YouTube.
I'll see what I can do with that.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Good afternoon and welcome to Grief Support Group. I'm sorry we're getting started a little late here. Thanks for sticking with it. If you were waiting for me, I'm Laura Stone. I'm the chaplain. And as we're starting to do more groups in person, we are not for now going to do this group in person because I'd like to be able to stream it also. That said, if you feel like you would like an in-person group, if you'd like to join in with people in the same room, please let me know. I'm not sure this is broadcasting over. Oh, there we go. Now I think it's broadcasting. Okay. So good afternoon and welcome. If you didn't hear me say this, thanks for sticking with it and waiting. If you've waited the 7-8 minutes here, we'll probably go just a little beyond 4 today. This is a chance for you to take a little pause in your life. If you're in the midst of a grief journey, you probably have lots of moments when you are aware of your grief, when you're aware of your loss. So this is just a time to be a little bit intentionally caring toward yourself. This is a time for us to gather together, to remember that we're not in this alone. There are many of you, many of us around the building who have experienced some sort of grief, and that could be all sorts of grief. I mean, we think most about the grief of the loss of a loved one, but sometimes there are losses of identity or losses of grief over situations that we work with also. And some of these things are similar, can feel kind of similar. So this is a time just to take care of ourselves, to really be intentional. And so as we begin, I invite you to take a little moment to get comfortable in your seat. I will read some sections of a book to you, and we will have some quiet moments for reflection in between. And in those moments of reflection, you might want to share with somebody nearby. If there is somebody nearby, you might engage in silent reflection internally, or you might want to journal or doodle or express yourself in some other way. A couple of things that are really important when you are in the midst of grief. One is to take care of yourself, your whole self, body, mind, and spirit. And when we gather, we can do that for and with each other. That's a little harder when we're not able to be together in the same room. So I'm trusting you to be kind to yourself. And the other thing that's important in grief is expressing it, finding ways to make it external. And people do that in different ways. And so if writing is your thing, you might want to have a notebook nearby. The book that we're looking at is Experiencing Grief by Kenneth Hawk, who was the founder of Stevens Ministries. And as you settle in, I want you to invite you to take a couple of deep breaths and just check in with yourself. Maybe notice where you're at today in your grief journey. Maybe think about what your grief journey's been like in the last week. Just take a couple deep breaths. The chapter we're beginning with is titled, You Cannot Not Grieve. When I was in 4th grade, I had a part in our school play. Before the opening performance, we were all a bit nervous. I remember our teacher telling us, just pretend no one is in the audience and you'll do fine. Years later, when I was playing basketball, our coach told us much the same thing about shooting free throws. It's mind over matter, he said. Pretend the crowd isn't there and the noise won't affect you. There are some things in life where mind over matter works. We can push them aside, ignore them, and they won't affect us. But grief isn't one of them. Ignoring grief won't make it go away or keep it from affecting you. You cannot not grieve. For years, I've used the double negative, cannot not, to emphasize that when we've lost a loved one, we cannot avoid grieving the loss. You cannot not grieve any more than you cannot not bleed. If you cut your finger, you bleed. If you lose someone you love, you grieve. It's as simple and natural as that. We can say, I won't grieve, or I'm not grieving, and then put up a strong exterior, hide our feelings, or even convince ourselves that we're not grieving. But we cannot not grieve. The death of a loved one will trigger a flood of thoughts, memories, and emotions that can't remain bottled up forever. Grief is the natural and healthy way to allow those feelings to surface and move out of us. Here's a quote by Marcel Proust. We are healed of a suffering only by experiencing it in full. People try to avoid grieving for many reasons. A woman who lost her mother told me she resisted grieving by taking care of everyone else, her father, her siblings, and her own children. She said, at the time, everyone said, you're taking it so well. But 10 years later, it caught up to me, and I finally broke down. One man told me, I always kept a lid on my feelings and kept an emotional distance from people. When my wife died, I simply didn't know how to grieve. I didn't know how to express my emotions. And even if I had no one to turn to. Eventually, he did find the support and acquired the skills that he needed in a grief support group. Sometimes the trauma of the loss is so overwhelming it complicates a person's ability to grieve. Mm-hmm. A woman whose brother was murdered said, I was totally numb for more than a year, and it wasn't until I read my brother's name in an article about the murder trial that I realized I hadn't even scratched the surface of my grief. Some people try to intellectualize their feelings. One man told me that he had attempted a scholarly approach to his grief, analyzing his feelings and discussing them on an intellectual level. Then a wise friend told him, you can't think your way through grief. You need to feel your way. He said, "That was a breakthrough for me. I realized I had been talking about my feelings as if they were something outside of me in order to keep from feeling them." Here's a quote from Therese Rando. "There is no way around the pain that you naturally feel when someone you love dies. You can't go over it, under it, or around it. Going through it is what will help you heal." There are many reasons why people have difficulty grieving. More important than the reasons why, however, is the simple truth that the emotions of grief need to be dealt with. Attempting to resist them or bury them can only delay them for a while. Eventually, they need to come out and will come out. It's better to let those feelings come out in healthy ways now than to have them surface in unhealthy ways later on. You cannot not grieve. Knowing this can actually bring you real comfort. It frees you to let go and do what you need to do right now. You're going to grieve sometime, somewhere, somehow. Let yourself grieve now so that you can begin to heal. A question for this time of reflection. Feel free to reflect on anything of this chapter, but maybe a question here is, are there ways that you are avoiding grief? And if so, what would it be like to allow yourself to grieve? The next chapter is accepting your grief. At a conference, a woman told me, half the battle is just accepting the grief and letting yourself grieve. Her words are simple, yet profound. Although it seems as if accepting our grief and letting ourselves grieve should be easy, often it isn't. We end up resisting our grief and trying to hold in our emotions. This can be exhausting and unhealthy, and it doesn't work anyway. Eventually, our grief will break through, so accepting our grief and letting it come out now is half the battle. Changing channels on the TV one day, I came upon a cowboy describing the secret to riding a wild bronco. He said, "Don't fight the horse or try to control him. Simply move along with him and let him take you wherever he wants to go." You can apply this bit of cowboy wisdom to grief. Don't fight your grief or try to control it. Simply move along with it and let it take you wherever it goes. Experience the feelings stirred up by your loss. Share the painful memories and talk about the issues that surface. It's very important for you to accept your grief because other people may not. You may find that people around you will mistakenly think that after a few months you've grieved enough and that it's time for you to get over it or get on with your life. Or you may run into people who may feel so uncomfortable with grief that they'd rather not talk with you about it. Whatever the reason, a lot of people will say or do things to discourage you from grieving. So don't depend on others to give you permission to grieve. Give that permission to yourself. There's a quote from Matthew chapter 5. "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." You are the one who is grieving, so it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks or says. At this point in your life, you need to grieve. Don't fight it. Don't try to control it. Accept your grief. Let yourself grieve. A question that occurred to me as I was reading this chapter. That might be a question for your reflection. If a friend came to you and said, "I'm having trouble letting myself grieve," what would you tell them? Depending on what's going on in your spirit or where you are in your grief journey, these may be very tender topics. So I want to invite us to take another little moment to move your body a little bit, check in with yourself, take a deep breath or two, and ask yourself what you need right now. How can you take care of yourself in this moment? We'll continue on with another chapter. Grief affects your entire self. Grief invades us so completely that I sometimes wonder if there are any ways we aren't affected. It's pretty much all encompassing. Although not everyone is affected in all the following ways, most people will feel the aftershocks of their loss in many of these ways. Psychologically or emotionally, this is the most obvious way grief affects you. Losing a loved one stirs up many deep emotions, perhaps even some you've never experienced before. Riding out these painful feelings is about the most important thing you can do. Socially, you've lost one of the most significant relationships in your life. That loss will affect how you view yourself, how you relate to other people, and how others view and relate to you. You may feel as though you no longer fit in with your friends. They may pull away from you or you from them. Spiritually, the death of a loved one touches the very heart of faith in God, and people can respond in many different ways. Some people will feel God is closer to them, while others feel God has abandoned them. Some find that their faith sustains them, while others re-examine or rethink their entire belief system, at least for a time. Physically, grief gets physical. It can affect your eating habits, so you might lose or gain weight. It can make it difficult to sleep or to stay awake. Grief can cause shortness of breath, frequent sighing, or dizzy spells. You can experience tightness in the chest or throat, headaches, gastrointestinal pain, or sexual problems. Grief can lower your resistance to diseases, but not every physical ache and pain you experience will be due to grief. So it's very important to visit your doctor if you have any bothersome or persistent physical symptoms. Here's a quote by Alain Bozarth. Many people overlook or are surprised by the physical side of grief. It is very real and it bears attending. Mentally, it's very normal to experience lapses of memory, difficulty concentrating, a slow response time, or absent-mindedness, well beyond the early part of grief. The fog of grief may last for extended periods of time or come and go. For this reason, grieving people are often more accident-prone, so it's a good idea to be extra careful when performing potentially dangerous activities like driving, home repairs, cooking, or exercise. Grief affects all of you, so don't be surprised if grief affects you where you least expect it. Don't try to do it all on your own. If you're feeling overwhelmed or unable to cope in one or more of these areas, ask for help. Getting help in areas where you're overwhelmed will help you focus more fully on the rest of your grief. You're only human, and right now, more than anything else, you need to grieve. A question for reflection may be, what are some of the ways that grief has affected you or is currently affecting you? And are there ways that you can tend to yourself in the midst of those? The final chapter for today, the many feelings of grief. The loss of a loved one stirs up a lot of intense, confusing, and even conflicting emotions. For a while, the numbness of shock may keep you from feeling many of these emotions, but as people move along in their grief, the shock wears off, the floodgates open, and feelings begin to sweep over them. Here's a list of some of the more common feelings that people encounter during grief. You probably won't have them all, but there's a good chance you'll experience a number of them. This list can help you name a few of your feelings and realize that all of them are very normal in grief. Panic or helplessness. Your world has been turned upside down because a person you loved and depended on is gone. It's normal to feel overwhelmed, powerless, and out of control. Worry or anxiety. You may wonder, how will I make it? Or what if something happens to me or someone else I love? Or am I going crazy? Fear. You may fear for yourself or for your loved ones. You may be frightened by the intense emotions or recurring thoughts you're experiencing, or because of changes you see happening within you. Anger. Grief can stir up a huge amount of upset, resentment, or even rage at ourselves, at friends or family who say or do hurtful things, at the person or thing we feel is responsible for the death, at God, or even at the one who died. Guilt. You may feel guilty for what you said or didn't say or do before or after your loved one died. You may be ashamed of how you've handled the loss. You may even blame yourself for your loved one's death or for not doing something to prevent it. Failure. You may feel that somehow you let your loved one down or failed in your role as spouse, parent, child, sibling, or friend. Emptiness or hopelessness. The death may leave you feeling empty and wondering, what's the use? Does anything really matter anymore? Despair or sadness. You may feel similar to the way King David felt when he wrote, "Be merciful to me, O Lord, for I am in distress. My eyes grow weak with sorrow, my soul and my body with grief. My life is consumed by anguish and my years by groaning. My strength fails because of my affliction, and my bones grow weak." Loneliness. For many people, grief is an incredibly lonely time. Not only is your loved one gone, but the resulting changes in your life situation can affect your relationships with other family members or friends, which can often lead to even more loneliness. Here's a quote by Corrie ten Boom. "There is no pit so deep, but that his love is deeper still." Relief. If your loved one had been in pain or you were the primary caregiver, you may feel relief. You may also feel relief if the one who died had caused constant distress for you or other loved ones. Happiness. You may sometimes feel moments of happiness, thankfulness, or laughter when you think about your loved one or in response to other events that happen in your life. People who are grieving will sometimes feel guilty or confused when this happens, since they think they should only feel sadness. You may already be experiencing many of these and perhaps other feelings. At times, some of the feelings may seem overwhelming. You may also find that your feelings change abruptly and unpredictably, or you may experience several different feelings at once. In time, the intensity and confusion will lessen. For now, let the feelings come and go and understand that they are a normal part of grief. I don't know about for you, but that chapter felt like an intense one. So here at the end of our time together, maybe take a couple of deep breaths and name an emotion or two that you're feeling right now. And now name for yourself or in prayer something that you want to take with you into this week. I applaud you for joining us. This is a hard thing to walk through, and to take the time intentionally is important to be together and to acknowledge some of the things that are going on, but it's also difficult. So as you walk into the rest of today, I especially today invite you to reach out for the support you need. Maybe call a friend or poke your head out of your room and say hi to a neighbor. Maybe reach out to somebody that you know has been through a grief journey also. Express in some way, take care of yourself in some way. The book that we are using right now, I don't have extra copies of it, but I can easily get you a copy. If you are appreciating this and would like a copy, please let me know. If you would like to talk, give me a call and we can talk. We'll find a time. And in the meantime, we'll continue on next week at 3:30 on Friday. And you all will be in my prayers in the meantime.